Hey friends, it's me Zoe, aka Magic Pixie Dream Girl. On this episode of the Lightcast, we're going to talk about the ancient culture and history of the desert. I made some observations a long time ago, and with a fairly recent, I say recent as in like the span of a year, not recent as in last week. Um, if you haven't seen McIntyre's video about the possibility of a slave link, I highly recommend you go watch that. It's very, very interesting, and I've done a lot of research on that particular topic myself, spanning back about a year or more, and I really want to share it. Secondly, you may notice that I sound a little bit less formal and a little bit less polished than I normally do. There's a reason for that. I started doing the Lightcast as a way to have a more informal stream of consciousness kind of thing, and I did the most human thing possible and immediately started trying to record them with a bunch of comped vocal takes and a lot of processing and a lot of other stuff that frankly just created a lot of stress for me. And so this is me kind of being and going back more to what I intended originally. My videos are going to of course retain kind of the tonal style that they have in the way I deliver my scripts, even if they seemingly get on the nerves of some people. But these are going to be me raw pretty much, with a little bit of editing, pauses included, thinking aloud, tripping over my words, a little bit more to the bone. So yeah, welcome back, buckle up, let's go. There's a lot of places that this could begin, but rather than completely rehash the desert experience that we have in Skyward Sword, I only want to touch on the fact that there's an ancient advanced civilization that collapsed. That is the thing that's known. They had a very robust mining operation there. An army of at least very convincingly sentient robots performing mining operations amongst other things, and then for some reason a whole other group of pirates robots that were like pillaging from the other robots, which is really fascinating when you think about it. A lot of thoughts I have about that. Mostly, I think when that civilization left, those robots were just probably out of autopilot or some shit, just like were operating in a loop forever for like thousands of years. Either way, it's kind of cool because it's like Skipper having like a whole, like there's a commissioned painting of him and his entire crew. I'm sorry, this is very funny to me. Him and his entire crew at his cabin, and he has like a miniature airplane, and like he was like living his life or whatever. But I'm not gonna really focus on that too much, because there's just very little we know. Like most of what I said is more or less it. Like that's it. Nobody knows who the advanced civilization it was. It's probably the Zonai, but we don't know for sure. And then of course, after that, let me back up, actually. The only other data point I think that's really worth mentioning is that several hundred years prior to the events of Skyward Sword, the the Lanayru Sea rapidly desertified for unknown reasons. And then let's fast forward to Return to the Surface, where the Hylians are, if you go by Historia, it says that Zelda returned to the surface to protect the Triforce. I have a lot of questions about that, but regardless. And then with Tears of the Kingdom Masterworks, it actually does back up the return to the surface being around that time. And it talks about how, specifically with regards to the Gerudo Desert, the Gerudo settled it, and they chose that place intentionally. As for why they did, nobody really knows. I literally can't wrap my mind around why anybody would choose a desert on purpose. My sense is that perhaps after the events of Skyward Sword, it's at least probable that because of Link's involvement in the desert and a few other people having some knowledge of what was going on in the desert that were in the sky, there had to have been some information. It's in another realm of reason that like people knew that there was valuable treasure, gemstones, lost mining equipment, lost mining facility there, a former very, very advanced logistics system in terms of like Lanayru Bay, that had to have been known. And then that has to be a motivation, because like otherwise, why? What is the point? And from that moment, like there's a really interesting dark place in history. And I'm not just talking about the era of chaos. It's very obvious that by the point that the imprisoning war happened in the era of prosperity, that there was some very, very deep-seated hatred. If you follow Tears of the Kingdom and Tears of the Kingdom Masterworks, it is thought that that is because Ganon felt very jealous about the fact that the Zonai who remained were doing public works projects all over the surface, and they felt left out, or at least Ganon felt slighted by that. I also don't feel like they need to humanize him on that level to even explain his actions, because I think his goals are beyond our understanding sometimes, frankly. So if you follow Alice's thoughts so far, then you get to the question of, okay, so the Hylians did not choose to have anything to do with the desert. Obviously, we don't know how that played out, how people were terms of the surface. You would assume Zelda being like the person with first party knowledge of like, I need to go protect Triforce. She probably initiated this entire thing. So it's not like the Gerudo were like, we're gonna go back first now that Demise is gone. Like, that doesn't follow, to me anyway. What I think you got instead is you have a group of people with advanced knowledge about gemstones in the desert. Why? I don't think it's for good reasons. There's a decent chance that, in spite of the fact that the mining set in the depths is a little bit more on the Lincoln Zelda size in terms of equipment, that it was either, it has to be one of two things at this point. It has to be some like splinter faction of the Zonai, or it has to be a combination of things, possibly including the Gerudo. The Gerudo had the knowledge, the Zonai had the technology. What do we think happened here? I think that there's a decent chance that the Zonai were not all super pious and filled with light, or they were so much that they felt entitled to what was going on there, including obviously the darker parts of history that we don't know yet. And I'm going to evidence that with some real world examples. If you've ever studied slave trade or slavery in the ancient world, one of the most common things that you will find is that are things called like slave trade beads, which are, we'll say, like necklaces and the string and candy necklace sense of the word, except with semi-valuable gemstones on them that are used to pay for the cost of a slave if they die, or used to show their value. And if you also look back at like clothing and whatnot of slaves in ancient Egypt, for example, their footwear was actually is got these like circular manacles on the ankles of it, so, and for obvious reasons, so that slaves can be tethered, chained, and all kinds of other stuff. And if you actually find pictures of them, they look identical to Gerudo footwear. Even in the modern age, it looks identical. The weird thing, though, is that the slave trade beads, if you look at those necklaces, they actually look a lot like the necklaces that Zonai wear. At least Vraru, Minoru, the ancient hero. And it's kind of fascinating because it's like, what the fuck happened? At the same time, if you take a look around Hyrule and actually go look at places where Zonai ruins are, they more or less do not exist on the central plane of Hyrule at all. They are more or less restricted kind of to Faerun, Sun in the Greater Desert, a very small amount in Tabantha, and then obviously the labyrinths, that goes without saying. But even those are not really in the central plane of Hyrule, where a lot of games have actually taken place when you look at them closer and look at their maps closer. And my sense of this may be that it's possible that the Lanayru region prior to desertification was used as it could have been a prison colony. There's certainly some evidence for that. While there are prison cells in various structures throughout the central plain of Hyrule and one or two other places, there is an entire E2 prison in the Gerudo Desert that is not attached to the Arbiter's grounds whatsoever. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that the Lanayru region functioned as a sort of prison colony. That can explain why you have the Zonai there, and you have the Gerudo demonstrating some things have been brought into their culture from their time, hypothetically, as being slaves. And there's other stuff too here. There's other connections to a potential like higher Zonai ruling class, possibly not being very great people. If you've heard me talk about this before in videos or in other episodes of the Lightcast, you'll know that I tend to think that there's a reason why the Zonai technology is all short lifespan. I think that it is done on purpose as a thematic choice as well as a gameplay mechanic. That's not to defend that I don't necessarily care for the implementation of it in the games, but I do appreciate the thematic part of it, most certainly. And it seems to me like there were some groups of people who were mining Zonite and other things, sending them to the sky, where some group was living in a utopia of their own design until they apparently all went extinct or something. And that still leaves you all these people down there who's mining it. So you have constructs now, of course, and we see those constructs doing the mining. There's no way that that was always true. There's just no way. Why would there be a mining set that's left behind in the depths if that's actually true? Why is it that deities like the bargainers exist in the depths? It's obvious that there's like this whole human-made and human-run culture down there, along with a bunch of other structures to support human life that, frankly, robots don't need. Something that I can't quite get out of my mind ever since playing Tears of the Kingdom is a quote that was said by Minoru, where Minoru goes, as a Zonai, I share blame for these events, talking about how everything is unfolding with Ganondorf and the Empress in war. The entire thing, frankly. And there's a lot of ways that can be interpreted. I've heard people interpret it as she takes the blame on herself for possibly the approach of trying to bring the Gerudo Desert into the fold. But I don't get, that doesn't quite make sense. Why would you assign the blame to your entire group of people, to the Zonai? That doesn't make sense. What makes more sense to me is that she is one of the last of the two Zonai from a group that's going extinct or in the process of going extinct, and she knows some of the history of what went on and feels incredibly guilty about it. You have to remember that when Rauru and Minoru came back to the surface, they didn't actually know the extent of what was going on in the depths. Masterworks clarifies that by saying that Minoru actually accidentally stumbled onto the construct factory, which is wild to my brain anyway. That shows this huge disconnect between Zonai in the sky and potentially Zonai in the depths. I think that if you start to put the pieces together, you start to see Rauru and Minoru who feel very guilty, but at the same time there's this other aspect too, where it's very easy to overlook what's going on, especially in the scene, the show of fealty, or the memory rather. You can focus on Ganondorf because we know him historically. It's easy for us to think bad guy and overlook everything else that's going on in the scene. Let's not forget that the Gerudo Desert was founded by the Gerudo as its own separate country when everyone returned to the surface. Ganondorf makes mention of Rauru's repeated invitations. That tells me there was probably some sort of threat of force behind that, as Abigail Thorne would say. And We don't know what that is. Obviously, there's a little bit of speculation there on my part, but still, there's like that whole thing of Raros like repeatedly being like, bend a knee. And then you have the Nero's Guild. I think that can't be overlooked. It has made me think time and time again that there's at least a decent chance that the marriage between Raru and Sonia was in part political, for reasons that are beyond our knowledge at this time. We just don't have that information. I think it is because the Zonai were not all good. It kind of adds up when you think about it. There are some other connections outside of the desert. So in the Wind Waker, we square off with Goden. Whether you caught this or not, maybe I was just late to the party and realized it like 15 years later. But Godan's title is actually the Great Arbiter. If you look at Godan now, knowing what we know of Zonai technology, like full stop, Godan was created by the Zonai. I don't even, for somehow that still seems to be up for debate in a lot of places. I don't understand how. That is not a Sheikah creation. All the research that I continue to see is that the Sheikah were not actually technologically advanced until much later. Possibly around the time, pick your branch of choice, but let's just say that the depth into each branch of like where Echoes of Wisdom is that. The Sheikah didn't invent the Gates of Time that we see in manipulating in Skyward Sword. That was actually created by Hylia. A lot of people don't know that. I don't think that they were that group. So I don't believe that they could have created Godan. The fact that Godan's name is the Great Arbor, and we have one other place in the entire series that is named with the word Arbor, the Arbor's grounds, there's no way that's a coincidence to me. If it is, that's really weird. Something that I observed a long time ago now, and I know that this is very much up for debate, and if my friend Larulian Historian is listening, he's probably going to immediately cringe where I say this, but that's okay. If you look at the Zonite leg guards and Tears of the Kingdom, and actually look at the knee, specifically the part covering the knee, it has the same exact points, like squarish points on it as Godan's head, like the head portion of his design, and the same split nose down the middle. It's very weird. That's a hell of a coincidence. What could be the case is that Godan and this other designer are actually based off of an animistic thing, because a lot of the Zonai armor, of course, incorporates animal design, spiritual things. It could be that both of them are based off of the boar, part of the animal triarchy of like the boar as the owl and the dragon. But it is very odd that the design is almost the same. And it started leading me to this place where I was like, Zonai building robots, utopia in the sky. Surely they didn't create a prison in the desert for a prison colony and leave a bunch of robots in charge of like judging human beings who are working there as slaves, essentially. Surely not. I would hope not. But when you start to think about all the little pieces along the way, it feels on brain with something that a very, very bad aristocratic class of Zonai might do when you consider what their goals are. That leads some other links, though. Regardless of like what happened with the Zonai and the Gerudo in the desert, I think that there are some other pieces we've got to tie together. One of those is you're in the Ancient Hero. So you have this dark green-skinned character with red hair, which is a trait that we've really only seen with the Gerudo and the Wind Tribe. And it's been highly speculated it's the Gerudo and the Wind Tribe may share a common ancestor. If you think about where the Wind Ruins are at, they're in like Tamantha, right? Or the Castor Wilds, but called Tibet, the Japanese version of the Nishgap. It's in the same general neighborhood as the Gerudo Desert, compared to the rest of Hyrule anyway. And when you start to like put that together, it's like, okay, so what if you have like a Gerudo and a Zonai, offspring of some kind? Could you get the Ancient Hero? Perhaps, maybe. I don't know. But then when you look at the elements of the ancient hero sign and the symbolisms of courage and things like that, you're like, you start to see Ephraimian. And then, like, what is the connection between those two things? Well, I have some thoughts. If you look at the design of Twin Rova and Tears of the Kingdom in the past, well, Twin Rova is commonly associated with red and blue from Ocarina of Time, and other names, of course, like their sprites in the Oracle's games are like red and blue as well. The colors that are on the inside of their robes or their capes or whatever are actually not red and blue, like straight on. They're actually closer to like a red orange and a teal or a cyan or something like that, with maybe a little more green than cyan, I guess, probably technically. But I thought that was really odd. And then you look and keep digging, if you just pay attention, pirate ships that appear in various places with the monster forces, the ones that appear to have been all locked away somewhere for God knows how long, most of them seem to be pretty well preserved. The mast poles all have the same color fabric wrapped around them as what you see on Twin Rova, and it started to make me think a little bit like, we've seen the Gerudo be pirates in other incarnations of Zelda, certainly in Majora's Mask, and it's made me wonder a little bit if that connection between Faerun and the Gerudo Desert is through that pirate thing, and if there was some interaction between the barbarians that were in Faerun and Gerudo pirates that may have been utilizing some of the technology left behind by the advanced civilization in the desert that collapsed. Were they the ones actually pirating the gems out of the desert? Is that how they may have gained some of the knowledge about what was there, either prior to going skyward, or perhaps some of them stayed the entire time and continued pirating while some of them went skyward? I don't know. It's hard to say. I think that can be that length that brings those two things together, the ancient hero and the Gerudo. And then it starts to explain perhaps a barbarian tribe that is perhaps a splinter group of the Zonai with very, very strong magical capabilities, working together with the Gerudo, which have their own dark magic. Their phantoms are actually, they're part of their secret that doesn't come from Twin Rova. That's actually a Gerudo magic thing. The ability to create phantoms. So you have these two things kind of coming together, and it makes you wonder a little bit if, like, that thing that was going on that explains either subjugation and revenge. Is that why the shorter Zonai have on things that look like slave trade beads, while Gerudo in the desert have on clothing that looks like the footwear of ancient Egyptian slaves? I think the only thing that would really be worse than one group being subjugated, such as Gerudo, would be finding out that the barbarians were another prison colony that was pushed out to the fringes of Hyrule. It's interesting, like, of talking about just back at the beginning about how, like, the Gerudo Desert has a prison that's separate from the Arbiter's grounds. Faerun actually also has a prison, and we saw that finally. Hey, and that goes in Wisdom. Faerun Temple has a prison inside of it. Although, weirdly enough, the Fire Temple from Ocarina of Time has one inside of it too, but I don't know if that was constructed after the fact. We're gonna leave that out. Anyway, moving on. Faerun has a prison. Faerun Temple has a prison inside of it, so we start to see. Like, it makes me wonder a little bit. Like, does like a ruling class just really subjugate anybody who wasn't them? And is that what we see the evidence of? Ultimately, I don't know. For as much anecdotal evidence as I have, and as much proof as I love to have when it comes to other things, like you see in my videos, this is one of those things where it's like, there's just too many different anecdotes still to really concretely say, for me anyway. I'm sure other people probably have more strong opinions, and that's cool. But for me, I don't think I can quite make the leap yet. It's seeming more and more likely to me that the Zonai definitely were fractured, and some of them were just not all that great. If it came out that that was the case, that the Gerudo were subjugated by the aristocratic Zonai of the past, I actually think this might be one of those rare occasions where I would totally side with Ganondorf and his revenge and be like, hell yeah, let's go. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a good time checking this out and listening to me be a little more freeform, a little less polished and tightly manicured. Just glad you're here. Thank you so much for joining me, and catch you next time.